Okay, Brother Muhammad, how are you, my brother?
Oh, fine, fine.
Yeah, I want to again thank you again for coming back to our show, Natural Niche and the Alternative Guy. We've been knowing each other for a long time, and I've always enjoyed talking to you, my brother, because you know, you have a lot to offer. So I would like for just to kind of set the tone for this talk. I want to share with you, and I want to share with the audience, a gentleman by the name of Stokely Carmichael. Some people know him as Kwame Ture. I had the opportunity to hear him speak back in the late 70s. And one statement that he made in his speech that really stuck with me, and I think it'll probably stick with me the rest of my life. And the statement was that these people will tell you what to think and have you think your thinking. You know, so that's what I just want to put that out there. Now, if you can share with us, you know, your background, your the reason why you got into this study of history, if you could share that information with us, and then we can move on.
Okay, my name is Muhammad Ali Salam. I was born and raised in the Deep South, Alabama, 1950s. My education, well, high school, public education that is, was at a school called Snow Hill Institute High School. It was a school founded by one of Booker T. Washington's first graduates of Tuskegee. And he modeled that school based upon the philosophy of Booker T. Washington. Of course, Booker T. Washington had many graduates who went out and created schools for Blacks based upon his philosophy. And Snow Hill Institute, called the sister of Tuskegee, was the leading one of those schools. And most of those schools today have been undermined and were destroyed with the advent of quote unquote integration. After high school, I attended and graduated from Lincoln University in Missouri under Dr. Lorenzo Green, a protege of Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History Week, which matured to Black History Month. And from there, I studied what was called Third World History at the University of Missouri, Spanish at the University of Alabama, and Arabic and Spanish civilization at the University of South Florida. I became interested in history, I guess, out of a sense of denial. As I was going to school, I was in a school with all Black students, a Black faculty, Black administrators, but the curriculum was entirely Eurocentric or Euro-American. And of course, Booker T. Washington was briefly mentioned, and Dr. George Washington Carver. But other than that, we knew nothing about our history, nor even the things that were in our very environment, because that school had produced poet Waverly Turner Carmichael, who people thought was going to be the next Paul Laurence Dunbar. Of course, he died young instead. A professor, Dr. Colley, who went on to be part of the Kennedy administration, and many other renowned scholars. As a matter of fact, Arthur Mitchell, the first Black congressman who turned Blacks away from the Republican Party toward the Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt, was a graduate of that school. So I could go on and name the great graduates of that school, but none of that was taught to us. I remember as a child, there was a spring in that area, and the old people told us that that spring was built by the slave women. And I also thought that that would be a marvelous story for the school to teach the students about. Your education, I always thought, should begin with your immediate environment and your immediate circumstances, and showing the precedents or the antecedent that puts you in this condition. And it kind of relates to what you just said about the statement that Kwame Ture, who in the 60s was known as Stokely Carmichael, said. And it relates to education as we define both education and indoctrination. Indoctrination really is a process of delivering and receiving information uncritically, unobjectively. And education, to the contrary, is a process by which the innate qualities of the human being, his innate moral, intellectual, physical, social development is brought out of him. That word education is from the Latin word educare, which means to bring out, instead of instill and forcing in, but to bring out. So those qualities that are dormant in the human being by nature, and this is why in categorizing the different professions to the degree of their importance, some place farming ahead of the teacher, and go as far as to say that the teacher is actually to emulate somewhat the farmer, because as the farmer cultivates the soil and is a husband to the soil, the teacher is to do the same thing to the student, that is to cultivate that which lies within. But in the history of what we call education, we have been more or less subjected to indoctrination. And that's because the economic powers historically who dominated the society always created the political system of that society. And they also created the educational system of that society too. And all of those institutions were formed by them to reinforce the dominancy of that ruling economic elite. So if you have the power, naturally, you're not going to allow for systems that would overthrow your power. So the question becomes, have man had education? I think it was Mark Twain who said that I've never allowed my education to interfere with my schooling. And if we look at the words of the American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, during the time of the development of public schools in America, he said that the public schools are being developed as institution for the reinforcement of this indoctrination of the American public. This economic system, as we know, was established on the backbone of slaves, of slavery. So the very wealth that made this society was birthed out of a system of human oppression. So you cannot have a system of education, a true system of education, because that would reveal the dirty hand of your origin and make it appear illegitimate, as you have, through your process of indoctrination, made it appear both moral and legitimate. I hope I covered some of that.
Yeah, so what we'll do then, yeah, because that was a good introduction to the topic. So let's go back to like, what was the intellectual state of colonial North America, both black and white, you know, during the slavery time? What was the intellectual state of both?
Well, we know that your New England colonies were far more astute intellectually than your Southern colonies. And that duality, the roots, the seeds of that duality was planted during the origin of this country, and it finally found root manifestation in the Civil War. So they were more elite and intellectually astute. And your early public education, which derived out of the common schools, were developed even during the colonial period in New England, as early as the 1600s. And toward the latter part of the 1600s, public education was a requirement in all of your New England colonies. While in the South, whose economy was strictly derived from slavery, slavery was the economic backbone of the South. The planter class, the wealthy elite who controlled that system, they were anti-education because they were exploiting both the black slaves and the majority white population.
It was. Are you saying that there were an elite group that was controlling both sides?
Yes, and that was the minority. Maybe 2% of the white population in the South controlled this slaveocracy. Now that we identify with all white people, but the majority of white people were oppressed too. But it was only out of the illusion of racism that gave them the idea that they were privileged. And with blacks, you had to come up with an anti-education system. So the South was very anti, though these planters, they had tutors for their children in their homes. And as their children got older, they sent their children to England for education.
So can you say that all of the slaves, even though they were slaves, were they ignorant?
No. We cannot say this at all because we have to look at the early slaves. We start with some of the early ones. Some of your earliest writers in this country. One of the first women to write a book in this country was Phyllis Wheatley. Well, this contention that the African slaves were so ignorant, I think, is more a myth than a fact. Because when we examine the information that is coming out today about some of your early Muslim slaves here, Abdurrahman Ibrahima was so intelligent that he even influenced the outcome of the presidential election of 1828. when Henry Clay became impressed with him and made it possible for him to meet with President John Quincy Adams. And when John Quincy Adams ran for a second term, the South began to talk about how he had entertained Abdurrahman Ibrahim, this slave, in the White House, and it turned whites against him. So it split the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, which enabled Andrew Jackson to win the election. And what it did, it also enabled Abdurrahman through his shrewd diplomacy. He got Morocco involved in the contest to gain his freedom. So he gained his freedom and he left and went back to Africa. We have men like Omar ibn Said and the texts that are housed here and many of the libraries now to show that his writing in Arabic. We have Muhammad Balali, the scholar, who wrote the Treaty on Islamic Law, the first one in the United States. We have Phyllis Wheatley, one of the first women in America to write a book, the slave girl who wrote a book in Massachusetts. And we have many other ones, like we have Frederick Douglass, who is an autodidact, self-educated man. And so there are so many of these scholars that appeared. We have Odesimus, who cured the smallpox crisis in Boston, Massachusetts. So that claim cannot be verified through history, but it was a myth, I think, created more or less to convince the masses of white people. And we have to understand that all of these myths were not created for Black people because Black people never believed them. They were created to convince white people of the inferiority of Black people so that they could justify slavery and kind of silence this large white population who are unemployed and poor because the slaves had all the jobs and of course were doing all the work. And we also see this tendency on the part of America if we look at what was called the Bacon Rebellion in Virginia, Jamestown, in 1676. And Nathaniel Bacon wanted the colonists who were controlling all the wealth to share the land with the white indentured servant and with some of the Blacks even.
Okay,
So
this is a time when, so this was Native American was involved in this.
Exactly,
In
because
this rebellion thing, right?
Right.
So when you talk about the Blacks and the intellectual aspect of Black slaves, the Native Americans were included in this process too, right?
They were also, yes, they were, yeah.
Okay.
But what I was trying to say in terms of American education, is that this incident, in order for them to placate the whites who sided with the Blacks, is that here they did what Eric, the first prime minister of Trinidad, said that racism didn't invent slavery, slavery invented racism, is that they came up with this theory of the inferiority of the Black race to separate whites from Blacks so that whites would never see themselves as equal with Blacks and that there would never be a coalition or a partnership between Blacks and whites. And that this pattern began to spread all over the South. And so this is also a part, I think, of how the educational system served to indoctrinate both Black and white, but especially to indoctrinate whites. And we see this again in the populist movement of the late 1800s, when the Black farmers and the white farmers of the South and the Midwest formed an alliance to go against the wealthy Republican Party who controlled the banks and the finances in the country. But eventually we see them whites now playing the race card to separate these whites from blacks.
So what we're gonna do then, I'm gonna let our audience know that toward the end of our talk, we're gonna talk about this critical race theory thing. So I just want to let our audience know that we're going to get to that part too, where we're going to ask you to discuss briefly about this critical race theory that's taking place now, in present day. So before we get to that, so there were laws passed in the South, and it was a capital offense for blacks to read and write. So what happened? What brought that about? Why were they fearful of the slaves?
I think two things. I think two things. One of them was that many of the rebellions were led by intelligent black people. But my theory is that black people as a mass was an intelligent people. And the second reason was that they were going at this intelligence that they were seeing in the black population. But it didn't work because of the drive that the black people brought here for education in terms of where they came from in Africa. Some of the great, let's remember the 4 leading universities in the world during the 14th century were located in Africa. So these slaves did not come from uncivilized background. When Europe was in barbarity, some of the leading universities and schools in the world were in Africa. That most of that, I think, is a myth, and we have to see this drive. This is why we have to return to black people as a nucleus of American history. The nucleus of any and all of the progressive movements in this country for fair education and everything is rooted in that struggle of black people. It is that movement of black people that made public education possible for all whites in the South. And we see this, as Du Bois said, the gift of public education is a contribution of black people. We see this during the black politician. Here's a people coming freshly out of slavery in Reconstruction. They take him of the Southern political system and they rule it brilliantly. And you have to ask yourself, where did these erudite political black leaders come from? Up from slavery, all of a sudden, they are running these political positions. And it was them who argued for a fairness for not only blacks, but for all people. And go ahead.
Well, I just want to understand. So then that we're talking about education, but what role did the black intellectuals have in creating some of these books that were in this educational system? Because even though you have some powerful black intellectuals, but did they have a role in creating some of the textbooks? Because it appears to me that it's still only a handful of people that's controlling the textbooks that this public education system is using. So
again,
do you have any input on that?
Yeah, again, that goes back to what we style as indoctrination instead of education, and to understand that the dominant economic class must, by necessity, take charge of the educational system, as it must take charge of the political system. It must ensure its longevity. So by ruling the public education sphere, particularly in the South, then you have to be very careful about what kind of texts are entered into those public schools. what kind of education is being provided there. Not only must you be able to decipher the textbooks, you must be able to decipher the teachers too. So you do not get the best of scholars in these public schools, nor do you get the best of textbooks. Because if there was any ethics there, then you would get those who would challenge the overall system. And I don't think that this was challenged in a way in which it received the notoriety that we know of. It was always challenged by Black until maybe in the 1920s with Carter G. Woodson, who is the founder of the Black History Week and later the Black History Month it became. But we have to remember that Blacks was challenging this paradigm. They had to challenge this paradigm of racism all of their lives throughout their struggle. And it is this struggle that created other forms of struggles as whites came to realize their own oppression. But they saw it out of the light of the Black movement for justice in this country.
And it's the same thing that's going on now that was going on back then, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so let's move on to like after the post Civil War era. And can you discuss the struggle of the freedmen for education and the argument between industrial education and classical liberal arts education?
Well, that became a very heated argument. And to a degree, much of that argument was imposed among Black leadership to divide them because both of them have relevancy in the true education and the need that Black people had. And when we think of industrial education, there's no better man to talk about than Samuel Chapman Armstrong, the founder of Hampton Institute, which later became what it is today, Hampton University.
And he was a white man.
Yes, to understand Armstrong, we have to understand his background as a child. He grew up in Hawaii, where his father was a missionary, and his father was in charge of education of the native Hawaiians. And his father, Richard Armstrong, was an extremely racist man, and he had some very crude racist views. And Armstrong, Samuel, adopted many of his father's views. And while he advocated an industrial form of education, or at least as he's known for advocating an industrial form of education, what Armstrong was more concerned with at Hampton Institute, and he said it himself, it was rebuilding the Southern economy and making Black people, the ex-bondsmen, more pliable to labor for white people. As he said himself, slavery had began the process of civilizing Blacks. Now Hampton Institute will complete the process. He didn't believe that Blacks were necessarily mentally inferior. He believed that Blacks were morally inferior from his perspective. And he didn't see slavery again as a bad thing for Blacks. And that he thought that only hard work, and that's basically what Hampton was known for. It was a place of hard work and discipline and Christian principles. And to make the Blacks see it as his Christian obligation, not to be resentful of his white overlord, but to see it as his Christian duty to serve as pliable as possible.
Okay.
Now, Booker T. Washington, as we know, was his prize student. And many people accuse Booker T, of course, of being just a protege of Samuel Armstrong. Now, Armstrong, as we know, was a Caucasian, as most of these Black colleges presidents were Caucasians up to maybe the 1920s. And these schools were founded in the late 1800s, but they was under the presidency of white people.
Yeah, because Hampton was the first two presidents were white men, right?
Your white men, yes.
But you got a lot of,
Tuskegee is the only one.
but you got
Tuskegee and what's the one in Ohio? I can't. It's not Central State, but the one Du Bois taught it. It had a black president, Daniel Payne. So it had a black president, but the rest of them had white presidents. Even Howard University, its first black president was Mordecai Johnson, I think, in the 1920s. But
they were most of these supposed to be historically black colleges were founded by white men.
by white men. Tuskegee was the only one.
Tuskegee was the only one. Okay.
Yes.
I know St. Paul's College was founded by James Solomon Russell, but he was very, very light skinned. I mean, not that have, a whole lot to do with it.
Yeah, a lot to do with it because all of us was light skinned.
Yeah, but the thing about it is, it was like, I guess the lighter you are, the more they kind of embrace you, right?
Well, maybe so, but we had some very good light-skinned black leaders.
Right.
So,
yeah.
I think they identified more with us than they did with that other side over there.
So it depends on what side of the fence they were on.
Yes, because of Booker T's accommodation, his quote-unquote speech in Atlanta at the Atlanta Exposition, many blacks up north styled him as a accommodationist to Southern white hegemony and oppression against blacks. But Booker T felt that blacks should begin developing themselves economically. And unlike Hampton, where he worked the students half to death, Booker T did develop a sound industrial school. And Booker T became involved in the economic development of black people. He even found the National Negro Business League in 1900. And Booker T was involved in the Wall Street development and expansion there in Oklahoma. So Booker T wanted us to subordinate civil rights to economic development. But the first thing you have to do is feed and clothe and shelter yourself. That didn't mean that he dismissed the liberal arts or classical education, these other aspects of education. But I think that, as he said, we must put the horse before the cart and not the cart before the horse. And so
was he the one that coined the phrase to pick yourself up by your own bootstrap?
I'm not sure, but he did say, cast down your bucket where you are.
Okay, yeah, I know he made some.
And blacks have had no period of economic expansion and development comparable to what was achieved through the Booker T. Washington era from 1900 up to the time of his demise in 1915. During this period, black people purchased millions of acres of land. And through the Negro Business League, the black business class expanded exponentially. And so we have to look at that model that he created and wonder, is it our abandonment of some of his tenets that is causing some of the socioeconomic status that we find ourselves in today? Booker T felt that if you're in a crisis, blaming whoever caused the crisis externally will not benefit you. You must start with yourself and develop yourself first and be dependent upon yourself first. You must solve your own problems and look to yourself to solve your problem, starting with your economic problems. And from this, the other ones will follow suit.
Okay, so now what are we going to deal with the aftermath of the of World War I and II how was that so significant in changing the status of American education?
Oh, that is very significant. But before that, could we say something about the Black medical schools?
Oh, yeah. Well, we can do that.
Yes. Well, this is another example that defies that myth of the inferiority of Black people, because during the post-Civil War period, Blacks developed up to 14 medical schools. And as we know, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams is the first American to perform open heart surgery. And he also developed the Providence Hospital there in Chicago in the 1800s. It's the first school that trained Black nurses. And so there were 14 of these schools. And these schools lasted all the way up to the time of the John D. Rockefeller intervention in the medical establishment in the United States, the oil magnate. And Rockefeller came to see how the oil, particularly the petrol oil, could be used to make drugs for medicine and push the American, because up to that time, the American medical health system was based upon holistic medicine. Rockefeller wanted to bring it to an end, and he did introduce what we are onto today, the dominancy of the pharma industry, as their theme was, appeal for an ill. And so in that process, Rockefeller brought in Andrew Carnegie, and they hired Abraham Flexner to view all the medical schools in the United States and in Canada. And as a result of his report in 1910, he abolished all of those schools, medical schools, except two, Howard University and Manhattan. But he also abolished most of the white schools too. And he removed Blacks off a holistic approach to medicine. Even removed any concentration or emphasis in the correlation of diet with health. And so
you said Rockefeller did this, right?
Rockefeller did this with the assistance of Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, and with their flunky, Abraham Flexner and his Flexner report. So from that time, they took over the remaining medical schools. They took them over and they changed the teaching in medical school from a holistic approach concept.
So now we can understand how this whole pharmaceutical industry, it's obvious that it had to become political too in order for it to sustain itself all the way up to this time.
Yes, and that's an example of how big money historically and the economic elite take control of education, because they even influence the newspapers and everything to write, and people spoke of holistic medicine as witchcraft, to turn the people away from that form of health. And so, again, this is another example of the economic power structure determining the direction in which your education will go. And this is one reason why I think Carter G. Woodson advocated for Blacks to become autodidacts, to self-educate. And some of our leading scholars, as you know, are autodidact. They're self-educated. Again, as Mark Twain said, I've never allowed my schooling to interfere with my education, because the schooling is in the hands of those who rule the society. So for true education generally in this kind of paradigm, to get a true education, you are somewhat forced to be an autodidact. And again, some of our greatest scholars, Frederick Douglass is autodidact. Mark Twain was autodidact. In the more modern time, Malcolm X is an autodidact. It was an 8th grade education, but a man who lectured at Oxford University and Princeton University. And even his teacher had only a 3rd grade education, was an autodidact. Men like Arthur Schonberg, the Schonberg Library, and his friend Hubert Harrison of the Harlem Renaissance. They were autodidacts. And so I agree with Carter G. Woodson that the only form of true education under that kind of paradigm is the autodidactic method.
Can you explain that a little more in detail for some of us that don't know what autodidact means?
Well, an autodidact is simply a self-educated man. Okay. Is a man who educates himself. And in that kind of structure, a man is freer in his pursuit of knowledge. It's kind of like what they had in the old days when I was a child, what's called the CLEP test. I mean, you could take the CLEP test and get a college degree. It's depending on what you knew. And if you passed the test, if you had accumulated enough knowledge on your own, you could pass the test and become a college graduate. And in the old days, you had people like Malcolm X and others who were able to gain a college degree in prison. And they were autodidact. George Jackson, who wrote Blood in My Eyes, he was an autodidact. And who Angela Davis was very impressed with. So our responsibility as human beings, we must understand, as Carter G. Woodson told us, it is our responsibility to increase in knowledge. We were created, as some scholars call the brain of civilization. We were created to know. We were created to be caretakers of this planet. And we cannot do that if we are in a state of ignorance and we come to define the purpose of schooling or the purpose of education is simple employment. And you have some people who go to college, get degrees, but they don't read after that. They read only enough to get a college degree. If they read something that is required in that particular field. But knowledge is a lifelong experience, and we must partake of it.
That's very good. So before we have one more question. I want to just go over this last question because this is one that.
Oh, you asked me about World War II.
Right, okay.
Well, we have to understand that World War II, it benefited the United States enormously because the war was not here, over here. The war devastated Europe. And prior to World War II, the United States was considered a backwater in terms of world knowledge. World War II kind of brought that to an end because many of your European scholars now sought refuge in the United States. And the United States itself was trying at that time to break with that European tradition. So a lot of those European intellectuals were frowned upon by many Americans. So many of them found employment in your Black universities. So your Black universities were some of the first colleges and universities with interracial faculties. Albert Einstein lectured many occasions. I don't know if he taught at a Black university, but on many occasions he lectured at Black colleges, particularly at Lincoln University. And many of those scholars, again, couldn't find employment in your white universities. And so But United States did use many of them because many of those Germans who should have found themselves at the Nuremberg trial came to America. And much of American technology, science, math, and technology took off because of those European scholars. And so also World War II provided the GI Bill. And the GI Bill, as we know, was an enormous boost in terms of college education for the American public. But prior to that time, college education had basically been an elitist kind of thing. But with the GI Bill, it opened the door, not just in terms of college, but it benefited trade school. It even benefited medical school because much of that money now and that enlarged student population interested and financially able through the GI Bill to go to college, to trade school, and to medical school. It expanded those schools, which was a good opportunity for the United States to do right by Black people. But the Black people who had served in World War II were denied those benefits. And in their denial of those benefits, your Black colleges were denied of those benefits because these white colleges gained great financial benefit from that GI Bill. It wasn't just the GI Bill, even Roosevelt's New Deal as a attempt to break the curse of the Depression. The GI Bill, the first social network in the United States that lifted up many Americans, that combined with the later GI Bill, which I might say is a part of the New Deal, had that in that New Deal in Congress, it was to be allotted to all Americans except domestics and farmers, or agriculture. And some 75 to 90% of Blacks they knew was in those professions. To keep from saying Blacks are denied, you just named the professions that we were basically employed in, basically.
But they eventually opened it up on, the GI Bill eventually opened up.
Eventually it opened up, yeah.
I remember taking advantage of that when I got out of the military.
That's largely due to the outcome, I think, of the Vietnam War.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, later on.
But think of how long that was.
Right.
Think of that wealth gap. Think of that loss of wealth. Again, a period in which you could have shown a good deed to a people who had built this country, sustained you. Instead, you just throw them under the bus again. And some of this might not seem as education, but again, education merely mirrors economics, politics. It merely mirrors economics. Economics is what controls your society, those in control of your economy, as it is today. Like not even 2% of Americans control the wealth of America. The rest of them are exploited. And they are gradually coming from under the cover of racism, some of them, not all of them. But until they can come out from under, this is why Black is the nucleus. Until they can come out from under the cover of that, they will not see their own oppression. And they will continue to blame Black people.
Okay, so was there anything else you want to cover before we get to this critical race theory thing? Because it's kind of like where you
No.
Okay, well, before we go, then could you please briefly address the recent issue of critical race theory and the 1619 movement we hear so much about, and why are the whites in such an uproar about it?
Well, Nicole Hannah Jones a Pulitzer Prize winner, writer, came up with the idea of the 1619 movement. And her philosophy is that American history, thus American education in actuality, should really start in 1619, not in 1776. It must start at the time that slaves were brought into this country, because slaves were the economic backbone of the United States. If it wasn't for slavery, the United States today would be a country economically on the level of Jamaica, we might say.
Okay, so what about, so they enslaved the Native Americans before 1619, right? I mean, that could be included too, right?
Yes, but
I understand what you're saying, but I'm just saying we don't want to eliminate that process.
no, we don't want to eliminate them, nor do we want to complicate both this and the Native American.
Okay, because we did a show separately on that.
Yeah, by not giving enough attention
Right.
to Native American education.
Okay, because that's how we're going
Because
to do another show.
Hampton also was developed for Blacks and Native Americans.
Okay, so
And
we're going to
Booker T.
do
Washington began as an instructor teaching Native American
okay.
at Hampton Institute.
Okay, so we're going to do a separate show dealing with the Native American educational process too, because that was
Very good.
a long process.
And at that time, we'll crossbreed him with Black America and America in general.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So we can agree that we're going to do a show on that educational process too,
Right.
and then
Right.
merge, because it's kind of merged, but then again, it's kind of separate too. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, so go ahead. I'm sorry.
You are talking about the United States.
Okay,
In actuality, you are talking about the Black man and the white man.
okay. After the United
You're
States.
talking about the colonial period.
Okay,
Because the Indian is not really part of the formation, or to a lesser degree. The history of the United States is basically a history of the polemics of the Black man and the white man.
that could be a mixture of the two. The mixture of
Now, some would disagree with that,
I know, but
and perhaps we can dive into that next time.
okay, all right.
Yeah. But the whole history of the United States was about the expansion, the control and the expansion of slavery in America.
Okay,
Of the 12 first presidents of the United States, 10 of them were slave masters, slave owners.
right.
So Nicole Hannah-Jones believes that American history should start with 1619, and slavery, in fairness, must be the nucleus. In order to get a true historical view of the United States, slavery must be the nucleus of American history. From slavery to Jim Crow to civil rights, up to the condition of the Black American today, is a true history of America and what it is about. And that is also true of the Native American, of how he was treated and how he is treated today. If you exclude that from American history, you do not have a true picture of American history. Most of the amendments, early amendments to the Constitution, one way or another, directly or indirectly, was geared toward slavery. There was an implication toward slavery. the expansion of slavery, the control of slavery. The Mexican-American War was based upon the expansion of slavery. The Dred Scott case, which Abraham Lincoln used against Stephen Douglas in his debate for a congressman in Illinois, which brought him to national fame. That was centered around slavery and the right of a slave to sue for freedom now that he is in a free state or territory, as Dred Scott was. So he freed for his freedom. Or the slave code of 1850 that came out of the Great Compromise from the Spanish-American War, which now made it a federal crime for anyone to aid and assist a runaway slave. And so all of it, these are compromises or acts. Dred Scott case went to the Supreme Court. Dred Scott case was 1856, shortly before the Civil War. Some scholars say Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom Cavalry and Dred Scott and John Brown are the three things that really set off the Civil War, though it had been budding for a long time. But those three things, those three occasions. So Nicole Hannah Jones, I agree with her that you do not have a true picture of American history. As I said, as a child, I had no knowledge of Black history. And the average Black person who went to high school or even to college, came out of college, considered themselves an educated person, had no knowledge of Black history or Black culture. And as Carter G. Woodson pointed out, this was stifling our development. He didn't just want you to have that because it gave you some self-esteem. He wanted it for that purpose. But he understood that no people can move forward who have no knowledge of their past, who don't understand their past. So of all knowledges that are necessary for an educated person, the social sciences, I think, runs more important than any of the disciplines, because the human being is a social creature. And of those social sciences, none, I think, is more important than history. Man must know where he come from. He must know what happened in the past that put him in this condition today. And if he wanted to avoid this condition, examining carefully those flaws so that he will not repeat an oppressive, backward social condition.
The saying, man, know thyself.
Know thyself, yes. It is another saying, I think it's of the Prophet Muhammad, that he who knows self knows God, he who knows God knows self. So it starts with self. It's kind of like the the guy who had amnesia and he was lost. He went to ask this man something about himself, hoping that he could help identify it. The man didn't know who he was. And he asked the man, after the man couldn't tell him who he was, he asked the man, who are you? And the man said, I am God. And the guy with amnesia said, you're not God. And the man said, how do you know? You don't even know who you are.
Yeah, well, that sounds like that's the situation that we're in as a people. But
that's the 1619 plot.
Okay.
You asked me about something else. Oh, critical race theory. Yeah. Critical race theory was an academic topic in the 1970s in your colleges and universities, where they were asking the question that after the civil rights movement and the black protest movement of the 60s, it still seemed as if blacks were not, the Latinos were not moving forward, that something seems to be missing. So they began to study racism from a systemic, structural point of view, from academic perspective. And some of that research began to point to the direction that it was more about systemic racism than it was about individual racism. And you meet a white person, he says, I'm not a racist. He might not be a racist. And so it's not necessarily that individual that's holding you back. You might strike up a friendship with him. But you as a black man is still subjected to racism because racism is systemic, it's structured, it's interwoven into the fabric of every institution in American society. And because we have ignored it academically, we haven't brought any kind of cure, a remedy to it. And so now with the George Floyd killing and the protest movement of recent, I think mostly whites jumped on a wagon and thought that this critical race theory might invade the public sphere. Now, there were teachers who had been trying to teach about racism in the classroom and about Black history in the classroom. They didn't call it critical race theory. That was a phrase coined by Black or white and Latino academicians at your university. And so now it's a big thing now, it's labeled critical race theory. So like as a principal in Texas that recently got fired, he was simply teaching these things. They wouldn't renew his contract. So many right-wingers and many governors, I think 20 states now, have attempted to pass laws outlawing the instruction of critical race theories in their school system. And they are left wide open to define what critical race theory is. Maybe teaching about Malcolm X is critical race theory. Even going too forward, Dr. King would be defined as critical race theory. Talking about the Atlantic slave trade could be critical race theory. Talking about perhaps Reconstruction could be critical race theory. So it's a backlash against the fear that the truth will be told. And these people who are out pushing it, they're now better off than we are economically. They just benefit from social capital of racism. They are not the ruling economic elite in the society. They always leave that to others to carry that out for them. But they do create these divisions. You must create a division between Blacks and whites. As long as you keep that up and they don't see no similarity in how that both of them are exploited by the rich in this country. Until that is realized. Now we even see in the early days of the American Communist Party was trying to recruit Blacks, and it failed because they didn't address the issue of racism. And it was racism that drove Blacks out of the Communist Party, back into the Republican Party. So racism is the cancer. It's a cancer that Americans themselves, Euro-Americans themselves created. And that cancer, we hope, is not fatal. We hope that it hasn't metastasized throughout the society so much that now it is fatal. But I think whoever is exploiting this critical race theory and their opposition to the 1619 Project, I think they should be grateful to similar movements like that to include, make American educational process more inclusive of other ethnic groups so we can have a total understanding of American history and culture.
Yeah, I think that that's the only way that you're going to solve anything is that the truth has to be brought out and it has to be more inclusive. You know, that's
Well, they say that truth is the first casualty of war. And so anytime you create a society like this based upon racism, you have thrust people into a conscious or an unconscious state of warfare. Because certainly you have declared war against humanity. Racism is a war against humanity, both against whites and black. It's against all humanity. So the problems facing all humanity would be better served if you serve the problem confronting black people, because they lie at the foot of most other races of people. I hate to use the word race, ethnic groups in the world.
okay. Yeah, okay, Brother Muhammad. Look, again, I appreciate you coming on to our show and sharing that knowledge and information with us. Again, I want to say that we will continue to have more shows of this nature. The name of my channel is The Alternative Guy, so we're going to always be trying to come with alternatives. I can tell you now that my love and passion is history and health. Those are my two passions. So that will be the type of show that we do on my channel. So again, I want to,
those are perhaps the two most important subjects a child can study in school.
Yeah.
History and health.
Yeah.
And this is why we have this epidemic in diabetes and high blood pressure, cardiovascular diseases, and cancer, is because the people have not been furnished with a knowledge of health,
right,
nutrition throughout their education.
right.
And without health and life, without health, you have nothing, you have no life.
Right.
So that's the most important subject, along with history. And so the money people do not want them to know about health and nutrition.
Right.
Because such subjects and such knowledge would erode their economic profits by serving chemical-based food that causes cancer and diabetes. Diabetes in 9-year-old children. It is one of the highest spreading diseases among youth now, is diabetes. And diabetes have all kinds of other side effects, glaucoma, heart disease, and children are being affected. Somebody, one Coca-Cola contains up to like 11 spoonfuls of sugar. And some people are drinking 3 to 5 Coca-Colas a day. And so
not only children, but adults are the same way. I mean, I know about
yes.
One lady, she was about 76, 77. And she used to talk about she used to have headaches. And I asked her, I said, do you drink water? She said, I hate water. I said, well, what do you drink? And she said, I drink sodas. That's all she drank was sodas. And then she wondered why she had headaches and stuff. But that's a whole nother subject. We're gonna do a show. We're gonna do a show about that. But those are my passions, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. Continue to watch and share, subscribe, and hit the thumbs up button, and continue to watch. Thanks again. Thanks, Brother Muhammad.
Oh, you're welcome, brother.
Peace.
Peace.